Do you believe this is acceptable, or should the Scottish Government introduce enforceable welfare standards for farm salmon into slaughter legislation? What would your policy be? And can we start with Catriona?
I'm not sure whether Scottish Labour has a policy on this. I personally feel that it should be, that similar welfare standards should be enforced in relation to farm salmon as other sentient animals.
Farm salmon has been an area that I've been working on extensively in the last 5 years. I've been calling, my predecessors before in Session 5, I've been calling for a moratorium or a pause on salmon farming, and a lot of it is to do with the animal welfare. What we found is that just the way in which the animals are treated, the high levels of mortality, treatments with chemicals, being bathed in warm water, which is something they naturally exist in cooler waters, all sorts of horrendous aspects to the industry that need to be, we need to take a pause and actually support the industry to get those things right. And I think at this point about the fact that there's no humane slaughter requirements for fish is something that we need to absolutely address. So I certainly want to take that forward and put fish on the same level as terrestrial farmed animals.
We haven't mentioned this in our manifesto, so I don't have a clear line on it. I'm personally quite uncomfortable with some of the images that you get from salmon farms and some of the impacts about how the salmon are kept and the escapees and the impact, and also what's happening to the rocks and the sea pens where the salmon are kept. But I think you have to work with the industry to improve that, and you have to use the powers that we currently have to deal with this. I do not know enough. I mean, I didn't sit on the Rural Affairs Committee, and I really wish Tim Eagle was here, who has sat on the Rural Affairs Committee, and will have had that information that Ariane had that from the to talk about fish standards, because I really don't know enough about it to give you a particularly coherent answer. So I will stop there.
So it's a subject of concern to me. I'm not quite sure, Ariane, how you can argue on one hand you want a moratorium, and on the other hand you would work with the industry to remove them. If you have a moratorium, there are a lot of people there still out of a job. So it's just to be clear about what you're doing there. I don't know enough about it. I certainly intend to look into it further. Obviously, I know a lot about the ice or salmon, and also the impacts that the Atlantic Salmon Trust and so on are concerned about, the impacts of escapees. So it's a subject which I intend to find out more about, and can't give you a definitive answer on it.
The moratorium is not banning salmon farming completely. The moratorium is a pause on the expansion of existing farms, which is something that's happening extensively around Scotland, or a pause on licensing of new farms. So it wouldn't affect people in current jobs, and that's actually something that I've been keen to address, because I have had people working in the industry coming to me and saying, well, what about my job? So this is absolutely very carefully considered. It's about keeping things as they are, because there are problems, and those aren't staying as they are. We're getting high mortality rates, there are all kinds of issues. We're basically farming sea lice, and some colleagues seem to think we've eradicated the sea lice issue, and then there's also issues of the interactions when farm salmon escape covered in sea lice, and they interact with our wild salmon, which is now on the endangered species list. Wild salmon are absolutely in crisis.
There was some discussion before we got started tonight with some of you in the audience at the back around questions of 20 years on, is that a piece of legislation that the Parliament should look at again? And I think that would be something that those who are elected as MSPs will in many ways perhaps look to consider. I do commend the Parliament, speaking objectively, of how it has sought to hold the industry to account, and I think it was your committee, and I think that needs to continue. The prevalence and importance of employment in the salmon industry, it does need to be properly held to account in ways not just around animal welfare but otherwise. So whether it's the Animal Welfare Commission and the Parliament as a whole and findings of the agency, I do think that this is maybe to be an area of discussion in the next parliament.
There are a lot of, for example, battery caged hens coming into the UK from European countries, supposedly 15 million kilograms in the first 6 months of 2025. Now, a lot of these are coming through to the food service hospitality industry where we don't know what we are eating. So going by the information that's readily available, are we on the one hand trying to improve the welfare of, say for example, our hens here, but then importing millions of kilograms of produce that use cages that we have banned, and we let them through the back door, and it's perhaps going against what we're trying to achieve. Would anyone like to add to that?
I think you make a very good point, and certainly it's something I've become more aware of, that I should be thinking about what restaurants I'm going to and asking further information. So I think there would be a good case for labelling being available to people who ask for it if it's not displayed publicly, about where people are sourcing their meat. And I think that's a really important question. So I would be in favour of doing that.
I do think there will be some consideration legislatively. I can't guarantee this, but I would predict on public procurement in the next parliamentary term. The last Procurement Act was in 2014, and a lot's happened since then, including Brexit. So in terms of public procurement, how local authorities procure resource in a whole range of ways, including, for example, school meals, that could all come up for contention in the next parliamentary term. In terms of private providers, so you talked about hospitality and businesses, I think what I talked about earlier around the social change, the impact of social media, the wider public consciousness that there is about these issues, that's where I think you could well see, beyond Scotland, more consideration and examination of what people are ordering in hospitality units, and then I'll be interested to see how that progresses.
Go in on pretty much what the area that Ben was talking about, so the Good Food Nation Act. I think that's a starting point. So that's focusing on our public kitchens, our school kitchens, where where kids get their school meals, in our hospitals, prisons, that kind of space. So I think that's a starting point in terms of us being a good food nation. And that is going to be what's triggering that public procurement work going forward in the next session. So the question was really about the private hospitality spaces, but I do think that we've got this space now, or this intention and underpinned by legislation of being a good food nation. So it's a starting place to get that awareness through our public procurement and in our kitchens. And also through the Good Food Nation Act, we have a Scottish Food Commission. At the moment, their remit is quite narrow. It is about supporting local authorities and the health boards to take forward their local Good Food Nation plans. But there's nothing to stop their remit from being broadened. And I think it's fantastic that they're there doing the thinking. And my hope is that they will do for Scotland in the food space, in the food system, what the Scottish Land Commission have done for our understanding on land, which has been incredible and transformative.
What is your party's position on strengthening or enforcing restrictions on their use in Scotland?
It's not in our manifesto. I am against electric shock collars, and so therefore we work to get rid of them.
We haven't written it into our manifesto, and I had a slightly opaque answer from when I sent through and asked for a briefing just to give us what were our positions on various issues. I know there was a consultation about this, that hasn't been enacted. If you personally want to know, I would be against an electric shock collar. My parents have always been dog owners. I don't own a dog because I don't live a lifestyle where I can give a dog the right attention and care that I think a dog needs. So because I don't have enough time to be at home with the dog, so that's why I don't have my own dog. My parents have always had dogs ever since I was a baby, and they have never, I don't actually think my parents' dogs have collars at all. They live a very rural life, But they are effectively trained, and they have never needed anything other than good training as puppies, and certainly no electric shock collars. So I fail to see the need why, when it is perfectly possible to train a dog, if you train a dog humanely, that you would ever need such a thing.
I agree, and our policy is to ban electric shock collars, and there are much better, more humane ways of training dogs.
I agree with the ban. In January 2025, the Scottish Parliamentary brought forward amendments to ban shock collars during the Welfare of Dogs Bill process, and those amendments were backed by every major animal welfare organisation in the room. However, the SNP, the Tories and the Lib Dems voted them down, and the Minister at the time not only refused to commit to a ban, he also refused to confirm that the government even stood by its own 2018 guidance. So that, to me, is going backwards. I would hope that Ben might be able to, if the SNP is in government, as the polls are showing, that Ben can use his strong animal welfare values to help actually drive this forward, because at the moment there's no open door. So that's a door that we all need to be pushing hard on in year one, and use existing powers that already are there under the 2006 Act. Wales has already done this, and the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission has said that they should be banned. That was in 2023, and as we know, 81% of Scots agree. So the mechanism is simple. It's about political will. That's what's been missing.
So first of all, I just need to remind everyone that I'm a serving Scottish Government Minister and bound by collective responsibility, and I just think it's important for people to understand that. Secondly, I just think it's important in context to appreciate that we cannot ban the sale of shock collars in Scotland. It is a reserved policy to the UK government, so that the sale question is not one that we can legislate for effectively in Scotland. It's a reserved matter. The use of shock collars is something that rightly has been debated extensively in the Scottish Parliament and more widely in considerations around devolved policy. And I would say that in 2018, of course, the Scottish Government issued guidance on electric shock collars and condemned their use, and that was something I campaigned for and got the then Cabinet Secretary Rosanna Cunningham to commit to. And actually, what Ariane spoke about in terms of whether the then Minister stood by was 2018, that was an intervention that I made from the backbenches before I rejoined the government, and I was pleased that he did commit to that later on in the debate at stage 3. So you need to. There was one day where it was ambiguous, and then it's confirmed as well. And we are absolutely committed to the 2018 guidance. There are then, the challenge in this area is, of course, that there are different types of collars, and there are many with particular types of collars that aren't as harmful as others who love dogs. There are people in Scotland who love dogs who are in favour of having some sort of shock collar available, and that's where it's difficult, because there's not a consensus position amongst all of the dog lovers who consider the issue of shock collars. Have we made progress on shock collars that's made a positive difference? Yes. Will this continue to be an issue of consideration in the next Scottish Parliamentary term? I do think it will be. And is there potential to make further progress for the welfare of dogs? I think there is.
I'd just like to come back. So thanks for updating that point. So I said there wasn't an open door, but Ben's just told us there is an open door. So let's push on it in the next session.
Hello, my name is Mark and I live in Edinburgh. What more do we want for our animals? Are we talking about exploiting them more ethically? Or is it least that they deserve? Freedom from being viewed as resources and entertainment. I would like to know, how do you and your party ethically justify using animals for any purpose?
I think it's a difficult one. People have different views. I heard somebody maybe here arguing about the Grand National, and you can argue that the race is too hard and it's been made safer. But I thought she had a very good argument, and so if you're here, sorry if I'm talking about you, until she said, and they're made to do it. And I did watch the Grand National, and I watched 5 or 6 riderless horses, go completely around the course again. I mean, they loved it. They're bred to love it, the same as the border collies are bred to enjoy chasing sheep. So
I'm not an ethicist. I'll be honest with you. Animals should be treated humanely. If we're using them as food, because we're using them for food, if we're keeping them in zoos, or if we're keeping them as pets, that they should be, we should try and respect them as living beings. I don't take the view that they are sentient in the same way that we're sentient. Of course, they have feelings, and of course, they deserve a high welfare standard. I am not of the view that we do not have the right to rear and engage in animal husbandry. And I think actually there are large areas of countryside where it is best maintained by animals rather than as part of the farm. If you look at how a pig can sort of harrow a field, really, or a goat can take a very boggy, unproductive piece of land and eat the brambles, clean it up, we can live in harmony with them.
In my view, we should be coexisting with animals and respecting them. We should be raising the welfare standards, and as part of our own humanity, we should treat animals with respect.
I think that is a question much broader than beyond Scotland and this parliamentary election. It's a bigger question about animal welfare as a principle of ethics, and a question for us individually and collectively. And I spoke before about my grandfather and why he became, in the early part of the 20th century, an advocate for animal welfare, when it really wasn't something at that time that was at all prevalent in British society or across Europe, although of course in parts of the world vegetarianism is prevalent because of religious reasons and has been for a long time, particularly the Buddhist religion and the Sikh religion. So I can only speak personally on an issue like that. I think it's a question that parties have to respect the different principal positions of all of the electorate. But I can say that as a candidate and as a person, me, in person, I've been an advocate for animal welfare all my life and will continue to be so. I think you said you live in Meadowbank, which would be in my constituency, so perhaps if I have the privilege of being elected, we can sit down and talk about this.
I've been on the Rural Affairs Committee in Parliament for the last 5 years, and I have been vegetarian since I was in my 20s, but over the last 5 years I've moved towards towards a plant-based diet and choosing not to eat animals. But I also work on behalf of, and I think Ben's point, that we have many people in Scotland who do, in terms of farm animals, do want to eat meat still, and so we have to respect that. So therefore we need to have best animal welfare standards, and that is something that we do have in Scotland. So something that happened for me, I'm from Edinburgh originally, but I lived in New York City for 20 years. And when I came back to Scotland and I became a member of the Rural Affairs Committee, I also became aware that Scotland really gets that animals are sentient. And that was really wonderful, because that doesn't exist in the United States in any legislative space. It doesn't exist in New York City, New York State. So I think we've got a fantastic platform to base the work that we're doing on. And as I said in my opening, we need to move away from the avoidance of suffering and move towards a standard that is about enabling positive welfare across the domestic, the farmed, and with our wildlife. But I do think we've got such this fantastic foundation that we really recognise in this country animal sentience, that animals feel pain and they suffer. And there are things that we need to bring into the legislation. Again, I said at the beginning, is that we don't yet respect that and understand that in fish and in crustaceans. And yet, in the Rural Affairs Committee, we had a fantastic professor coming in talking about salmon and the fact that they are sentient beings. So I think we need to work to bring that into our legislation as well.
I'm interested to know what the panel would think in terms of what further action we can take to protect Scotland's breeding raptors from the increasing frequency of spring and summer harvesting across the commercial plantations.
I would need a bit more detail to give you a substantial answer, sir, but what I would say is that I do think that we've made huge progress together collectively as a society and as a democracy on improving raptor numbers, including the fact that we have peregrine falcons in the city, which is extraordinary and a great step forward. I do know that across the Parliament and within government there's a continued aspiration to continue to increase our numbers of birds of prey and support them, while also working appropriately with our farming community. And as you probably are aware of, everyone in the audience, I would encourage you, if you're passionate about this and any other issues, once you have your constituency and regional MSPs in place, to engage with them and ask them to write to the government, because that is together how we've made progress so far, and that's how we'll make more progress today.
There's a conversation that needs to be had with the forestry sector. One of the things that I've discovered in these last 5 years is actually getting people in the room and making people aware of the issue, bringing everybody, all the different stakeholders and interests together, and having that conversation is a really important way forward, because people do want to do the right thing. I think we've got good legislation in place. There are alarm bells around our golden eagles that are clearly there. And if the industry understood that people are paying attention and we're aware of what's happening, I think that they would act on it. I would like to say I will convene that conversation in the next session if I'm re-elected.
Because they're clear felling huge amounts on the A9, the next stretch of the A9 that you know in Burgess, and you drive down several miles, and the amount of felling, and it's quite interesting. I've seen quite a few kites actually, which I have not seen there before, which I think are looking for all the little animals in the ground that they're going to catch. So it's obviously an issue. It's quite hard to see what you do with that. For instance, if you take my example, you're not going to hold up what's already been held up a long time, the move on to build the A9. So like many other instances, it's often the removal of nature which is causing the problem, and building was causing the problem. And so we have to first be aware of it and brought it to the attention of people, and then you have to see if you can come up with an answer. But certainly, as I say, the example I'm giving, I don't see an answer to that. I think, not just raptors, but there's going to be a huge amount of wildlife affected by the scale of what's going on there. And yeah, people have wanted to dual that. It's happening. I don't know, but it's an interesting point.
I'm reminded of something that was said to me, which is not about raptors, so I'm going to take a little diversion, and I've got a short answer for this. Who was talking about actually in Edinburgh the Water of Week, and how when he was a boy, and he's a little bit older than me, it was sort of pretty much industrial, rotty, and there was nothing there. And now we have seen in the last 50 years that become an absolute haven for wildlife. And I've seen otters when I've been walking back from Slateford to Roseford, which is magic. So even when we do, we can improve our environment. But I think Ariane's point, that if you don't put people in the same room and say, this is the problem, do this bit over here, can you alter your practices to take this into consideration, is the start of something quite powerful. Because people may not realise, and there is an assumption that if you care passionately about something, everyone else knows, and it's absolutely, it's as plain as the nose on their faces, because you care passionately about it. So many times as a councillor, which is being a politician, I have seen people who really aren't aware that there's a problem, and so they don't know that they need to get in the room and talk about it and find a solution. Because, the birds of prey, you all know this, that there's something so special, even if it's a peregrine falcon in the middle of Edinburgh, or it's a golden eagle in the Highlands. It is so spectacular and magnificent. I think there was a shared vision in Scotland, there's a shared wish in Scotland to protect that. So start the conversation, and if Ariane is much more likely to get into Hollywood than I am, is willing to do that, I'd take her up on that.
Don't have anything to add to all this. very interesting answers. Safe to say that this is only the very beginning of that conversation, and thank you for bringing it to our attention.
Only 2 local authorities implemented firework control zones in 2025, despite the legislation being available. What will you do in the next parliamentary session to ensure FCZs are more accessible, consistent and practical for councils to implement?
As I understand it, it's possible to silent fireworks. I'm interested in that, if that's possible. Obviously, that seems like something we should be pushing for. I've heard that, and that was the correct thing. In terms of controls, there certainly should be more controls on fireworks. I think would be possibly restrictions on only having organised displays. The fact that people use fireworks on more than one night of the year is a big problem for people with animals as well. If you know that it's just the 5th of November, people who have dogs who are concerned about it can keep them indoors. They can perhaps give them a sedative from the vet if they want to do that. I personally not in favour of a total ban at this stage. I think it needs looked at.
So Scottish Greens is in our manifesto, we would like to bring tougher rules around fireworks to minimise stress for all animals. Having said that, I think maybe an area that this coalition could push on, I was the convener of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee, and perhaps many letters going to the next convener of that committee, it would be me, asking for the committee to take on a bit of proactive work around why is it that only Edinburgh and one other local authority have actually made use of these powers. They haven't been around that long, and sometimes it takes a while for things to filter through the system in councils or local authorities. So I would say that might be a great piece of kind of work in the national space, because that committee can invite COSLA and local authority representatives to come and talk about it, and that would be a really wonderful thing to get the conversation going, to understand why aren't they using them, because absolutely these control zones are essential. In the long term, and this isn't party policy, but I'm interested in the idea of selling fireworks. If you think about it, the Edinburgh fireworks that happen at the end of the festival every night from the castle happened, I think, with a lot of music. So they're not silent in a way. So I don't really know the technology around silent fireworks, or whether that's bad in other ways environmentally, so I don't want to look into that. But I think organised events potentially is the way to go. Having lived in New York City, where fireworks got very out of hand at some point.
Obviously, I said earlier, I represent Edinburgh City and the Council of Edinburgh City Council. We're one of those 2 local authorities that have introduced firework control zones. Specifically, 2 of our areas are specifically to do with animal welfare. The one is at Seafield, which is to protect cat and dog home, and so that they don't get disturbed, and the other is in Strawford Hill, which is to protect the zoo, the tragic death of the red panda of its baby, which the zoo felt was related to fireworks in the timings of those deaths. So we used it. We have firework control zones also to deal with antisocial behaviour from on large scale youth antisocial behaviour that's happened and is quite unique to Edinburgh. So I'm certainly in favour of using them. We have other issues with fireworks as well. I famously once called for a ban on fireworks, which attracted a certain amount of media attention and wasn't entirely popular. And that is the difficulty, that people people like them. But actually, we now have so many fireworks. My sense is that this is shifting away and towards that organised events only, not only protection of animals, but also disturbing of people and disturbing of children, because more and more people are using them. So I think we need to increase the controls there for both animal welfare and social behaviour.
Well, it seems to me that using the licensing regime in the way that Edinburgh City Council has done is good both from a safety perspective and also from an animal welfare perspective. So I see no real downside to that. So perhaps the other local authorities should follow their example.
So as far as I'm aware, the sale of fireworks is reserved So the question of purchase is something that the UK government would need to be proactive in, and I do think that's an important point to raise though, because it's actually people getting fireworks and using them anti-socially often shouldn't be able to purchase them, which is one of the biggest challenges. The Act that we brought in around use of fireworks, so using the power that we had in the royal policy areas, and giving that discretion to councils has worked. I mean, it's made a positive impact here in Edinburgh. It's not perfect, but there has been a positive difference made, including in my constituency, where certainly in the constituency I represented for 10 years, in the north of Edinburgh, we saw a huge marked improvement than there was before. And of course that Act kind of pushes us towards having more organised displays if you have control zones, and I do think that that is a reasonable place to be oscillating towards. In terms of fireworks per se, I don't think that there should be a moral ban. I mean, I think that events like Edinburgh's Hogmanay, the Tattoo, Chinese New Year, Diwali, and other festivals like the pagan celebrations are really important parts of our diverse culture and what we offer to the world in terms of experience. And because they're events that are well known about, then that gives animal owners enough information in order to make sure that the animals are considered and their well-being is considered. So there's a balance to find. I think we're in quite a good place in the capital city. There's some changes that we can make. So my kind of pushback would be perhaps this is more an issue for the local authority elections next year, and to ask councillors, why are we not using the powers?
The final question that we have been given here is cat microchipping is already compulsory in England and Wales, but Scotland has not yet introduced equivalent legislation. What commitment can you give to progressing compulsory cat microchipping in the next parliamentary session? And can we start with Ben, please?
Cats Protection and the others involved in this campaign, congratulations, and it's been good getting the emails that have been piling in for the last wee while. I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but our manifesto's out later this week, so we'll detail our policies.
When I worked down south, when I first qualified, I saw the cost of cat protection move a lot. We spayed a lot of cats and neutered a lot of cats. I'm not sure what its aim is, to be honest, because they are regarded at legal law as wild animals, and the owners are not regarded as liable if they cause an accident, road accident. Obviously, you can be able to clarify that for me. So, is this about cats being stolen?
It could reduce the number of cats missing and ending up in rehoming centres, but please do correct me if I'm wrong.
Helen's alluded to the fact that cats don't have the same protections as many other animals in law. One of the fascinating things being a councillor was planning committee visits, and I used to do it with 2 ex-policemen, so I learned all about chapon, which is that a sheep, a horse, an ass, a pig, an ox, a goat and a dog, chapon D, are all protected, and you have to report if you hit them, but you don't, and the missing in that list is a cat.
Yes.
So you do not have to report to the police, which is, I'm a cat owner, I'm a cat lover. So I have always found this thing down there, and I did say when I came, I said, I don't care what the party policy is. If they ask me about microchipping cats, I will be saying I'm committing the party to it. Just because I do think it's unfair. Cats go missing, cats get lost. We've all heard stories of a cat getting into a car and ending up. And if you haven't microchipped your cat, which mine is microchipped, and there's no way of reuniting that cat with their owner. So I am all in favour of it, and I just committed the party to it. So I will speak very nicely to our manifesto writer and say that that's going in next time.
I approve of that commitment.
Well, I'm in the happy position that Scottish Labour is already committed to compulsory microchipping of cats.
It's something that we supported in the last session, and I think during various bits of legislation around dogs, the cat microchipping came up, and my sense is that the government was fairly open to it, but there was some more information that needed to come forward. So certainly Scottish Greens would support any campaign around bringing forward microchipping in the next session.
This came up earlier, the idea of imports being a threat to the UK welfare standards and Scottish welfare standards. We know this is a much bigger problem after Brexit and the threat of imports from much lower welfare standard countries. But at the moment, when consumers choose products, most of them are not labelled in any way about the method of production and the welfare standards that are priced into the cheaper products that we assume consumers are buying by choice, but actually have no information about. So what would you do to improve the labelling of inhumane products so that consumers know what they're buying?
Thank you for that. And I suspect when I referred to that, the choice I think people were making was with their purse, because there's a question of do they know what the different welfare standards are of countries, but also it's a question of how much money do people have to spend on food. The way you get around that is having meaningful labelling, and that is something that I think we need to go. We need to have a conversation about and let them work on together, because better, if we have higher welfare standards, better labelling is going to protect our farmers and enable people to make that choice on a welfare level. So I mean, I'm committed to, well, I can't commit the party to anything, but if I got it, that's something I want to work on. I just apologise if I gave it wrong. I didn't make the position of the party on shock collars. But I think Ben summed it up, that if it's a sale thing, we can't do that. That would explain where we are on that. But I would be happy to have that conversation about welfare labelling, because I think it does protect our farmers who are producing at a higher welfare level. If you were going to look at banning farrow crates, then that has to be part of the quid pro quo to the producer, that it's very clear why their product is more expensive.
I hear my fellow panellists to my left muttering that this is a reserve power, and we would work closely with the Westminster Government to make sure that farmers were not undercut on this basis, and that there was greater awareness of what goes into your product, and that it's worth paying extra for the higher welfare standards that we would want to have here in Scotland. Of course, we are in a world with where there's a cost of living crisis that is ongoing and probably getting worse again because of this, the latest events of the foreign affairs area. And so we have to take that into account, that people can't have limitless money spent on food. But I would advocate, as I'm sure my two colleagues to my left, that the alternative is to go vegetarian, and then you don't have to, the price of meat is much less important in your weekly shopping bag.
I just want to be clear, I'm not advocating that people become vegan or vegetarian. And actually, if you read Ravenous by Hugh Dimbleby, he led on the UK government's report on food and turned it into this amazing book. He talks about the need, in terms of climate change, for people to reduce the amount of meat they eat in their diet by 2 days worth of meat. So he's not even saying that people need to be vegan. And again, it's free choice. But in terms of the labelling, so that is a reserved issue. It's, I think, a point of incredible frustration for farmers in Scotland, because we do have very high animal welfare standards, and then we are caught in the issue of this legislation called the UK Internal Markets Act. So when there are trade deals done, for example, in Australia, who have much lower standards in terms of how sheep are raised, people don't know that. They don't know the difference when they're looking at a product that is lamb raised in Scotland or a product that is lamb raised in Australia. They don't know the difference in how those animals have been treated. So labelling would be a wonderful thing to be evolved. Maybe that's something that we should ask for. It is certainly something that I find, talking to farmers, they're very frustrated about that. One place that we could potentially look in in terms of looking for local Scottish produce is that Scotland is a good food nation. We have a Good Food Nation Act, and the government wrote its plan, and now in the next year or so, all 32 local authorities and the 13 health boards are going to have to write their plans. And there's an opportunity in there to direct spend, public purse spends, local authority, health board spend, towards local, well-raised, animal standard product produce.
What I would say just around that question that is relevant is the UK Internal Market Act, because it does have an effect on us here in Scotland when it comes to devolved policy around animal welfare, because if we were to take action that created higher animal welfare standards that then increased cost north of the border, then particularly the big supermarkets and suppliers could bring in produce from south of the border at a lower cost if there was a lower animal welfare standard. So the Internal Market Act has an effect in how we make progress on animal welfare between Scotland and the rest of the UK as well. And that's why the Scottish Government is so proactively engaged with the UK Government on these issues, to try and push UK Government where appropriate to do the same thing as Scotland. So while we in the Scottish Government want to do things differently where we can, that's the point of devolution, to make improvement. But if it has an unintended consequence where actually it just means that, say, English farmers get more orders than Scottish farmers, then it doesn't have the effect on improving animal welfare overall and just undermines Scottish agriculture. So the Internal Market Act causes a lot of issues, and this is one of them. The UK government should get rid of it, because it's anti-devolution.
So in our manifesto, we're committed to clearer labelling. I think we already have to have country of origin of food on the labels. Certainly, I always look for them. And some of the supermarkets and obviously small shops, you can ask where things are from. So one of the best ways to be sure about it is indeed to look for British and look for some line of continuity about where it comes from. We're committed to trying to increase the target for how much of our food comes from within Britain, and that helps welfare as well as being a security issue. And I would commend us finding better ways to get venison through the system. Venison, is generally shot on the hill, so if you eat meat, then it's not been treated with anything. It's been shot quickly. It's more available now, and in fact I know someone who's running a social enterprise where they're putting venison in burgers and sausages into food banks, which is good for people that are using that. So yes, better labelling definitely, and more British food I would suggest. Thank you.
What is the number one animal protection issue you would champion if elected in May? Helen?
Non-slum slaughter.
Joanna?
Microchipping cats.
Katrina?
Farrowing crates.
Ariane?
It's so hard to choose one. I feel like we're so close with the shock collars, or champion them.
And Ben?
We're just speaking about the party and also still in government, but what I would say is that there's a multitude of areas where we can make more progress. One area that I think is really important and feel passionate about personally is the proper and effective implementation of the action that's already been taken against food traps. And I think that's something that we really need to see implemented well.
A huge thank you to everyone that turned up tonight. The audience for supporting More for Scotland's animals, your compassion, your kindness, your need for change, all of the questions that you're so eager to ask is why you are here tonight. And a final infinite thank you to all of the charities involved in More for Scotland's animals. You keep fighting for our animals every single day, tirelessly. You give them a voice and you made tonight happen. But remember folks, make your vote count. And if you haven't already, please get in touch with the MSP candidates in your area and ask them to sign the pledge saying they will do more for Scotland's animals. It's been an absolute honour to do this and a pleasure. Good night, big love, and keep up the good fight.